Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This episode of the Sports Spectrum podcast with ESPN.com senior writer Chris Lowe is brought to you by Compassion International. For $38 a month, you can release a child from poverty. It's that simple. Go to compassion.com/sports spectrum, and your $38 sponsorship for a child provides them food, education, medical care, and vocational training. Over 150,000 children coming to know Christ in the last year alone through Compassion International. Go to compassion.com/sports spectrum. The best $38 you'll spend every single month. Sponsor a child today. Our guest on the podcast today is Chris Lowe. Chris covers college sports, college football for ESPN.com as a senior writer. And Chris is a graduate of Tennessee and grew up in South Carolina. And on this episode of the podcast, it was really just fun to talk to Chris about his journey of faith. He's a man who is out there covering sports every day, covering football for ESPN, the biggest media company in the world, sports media company in the world, and writing stories every day. And I just thought it'd be interesting to hear Chris's testimony and journey, but also to talk about the idea of telling these stories, these positive, uplifting, encouraging stories of faith and how his world intersects from a sports perspective as well as a faith perspective in Christ. So take a listen. ESPN.com senior writer Chris Lowe, and here's his story on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Chris, welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you, Jason. It really is. I listened to several, and it's good to be a part of it.
Chris, good to talk to you. I'm really happy that you're here and excited to kind of learn about your journey, just watching you on social media. And you and I have certainly interacted in different places at different times, even during my time at ESPN, but since then through social media. So let's start, I guess, from the sports perspective with college football. Just ended, a month or so ago. Clemson, the national champion. Share some thoughts now as you look back at the 2018 season and kind of what stood out for you as you watched that season progress, maybe on or off the field.
Well, I guess, Jason, first of all, we probably ought to rename the college football playoff the Clemson and Alabama Invitational.
It seems that way, right?
That's sort of what it's become. And kudos to Dabo Swinney and Nick Saban for building their programs to that point. I mean, when you look at how dominant those two programs have been over the last 4 years, the way they've recruited, and not just recruited, but developed talent, and get guys, Nick and Dabo both, to get guys to buy in to their system and thrive in competition. If you've ever had a chance, and I've had a chance to watch both teams practice, you're getting 4- and 5-star players that want competition. And that's what I think has separated those two programs over the last few years is they've been able to get those guys on campus and they feed off of it. So I think that's the first thing. Those two programs, and they're different, but they're same in a lot of ways. They've been built from the inside out, offensive line, defensive line. And, Nick and Dabo are different personalities, obviously, but they're really good friends and have a lot of mutual respect for each other in the way they do their thing. I think that's the thing on the field, just how those two programs once again rose to the top and ended up playing again, for the national championship. So it's 2-2, I guess, over the last 4 years, right?
Yeah, it's funny how fans are so it can be polarizing in a lot of ways. It's like the Patriots in the NFL. You see them every year, and they keep winning every year, and fans are like, I think, jealous, sick of them, wanting to see somebody different, but yet from a sports perspective, and I think I've come around on this too a lot, from a fan perspective of just appreciating when you see greatness and just understanding how difficult it is to do what they've been able to do each and every year. And maybe it'll be back again next year. I'm sure they'll have a great team and they'll be right up there near the top, and a couple things go their way and we might see their matchup for the 5th time, right?
Yeah, well, and I'm like you. I love excellence. I love watching excellence play out. And it's also fun to watch the team that maybe slides in under the radar and challenges one of those teams. And let's not forget, when Dabo Swinney was named the head coach at Clemson, he was a receivers coach. In fact, I love the conversations I've had over the years with Terry Don Phillips, the former AD at Clemson who hired Dabo. He says people thought he was crazy.
Yeah.
to hire Dabo, but he had the faith that Dabo was the guy, and Dabo sort of had that vision, and he gets the job, and initially it's not great, it's not like they're, you know, elite right away, but boy, he just stayed the course, and now here they are, and I've enjoyed watching the way that Clemson program has progressed over the years, and certainly the way Dabo has run it. And you talk about different ways to coach teams and run a program. Everybody has their own style, but Dabo's ability to coach those guys with tough love, and they know it. If you ever had a chance to spend time there in the complex and around him, Dabo is one tough customer, but those kids know how much he cares and loves them, and you see it by the way they play and how hard they play.
What about off the field? Maybe a story. Obviously, Tyler Trent, I think, was one story that captivated a lot of people. We had Tyler here on the podcast before his passing, of course, and then talked to David Blau about Tyler a couple weeks ago. But is there another story, and maybe it is Tyler, but is there another story off the field that really kind of captivated your attention, and maybe it was one that you covered or just one that you were interested in from afar?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say about Tyler is God bless him, and the way, he showed everybody the courage and the strength,
Yeah.
the dignity during the toughest of times. And it's a reminder to us all that God's with us, the top of the mountain, the lowest of valleys. And Tyler personified that and just lived it. And just how awesome to see, the way he walked that walk. I think for me, the other one is one that touches home personally for me because I had a chance to spend some time with him and write the story. And several people have told the story very beautifully as well. But the Ergel family, Joshua and Kristen Ergel, and their 3 kids. Their youngest daughter, Landry, has a rare gene mutation. She's one of, I think, 4 or 5 in the world that has it. The only one in the country. There's no known cure. I had a chance to spend most of the day. Josh was the former offensive line coach at Austin Peay. He's now at Kansas under Les Miles there, and he is an example of a guy that a father, a coach, a husband who is just so strong. And his wife, Kristen, the way she's been there, I mean, she has been Landry's 24/7 caregiver. You're talking about a little girl that was never even supposed to make it out of the hospital. Now here she is, 6 years old, and Josh says every morning before he goes to work, he goes in her room, she's got this big smile on her face and just fighting to live every day.
Yeah.
Because she's so susceptible to infection. And the thing that they say, and it's sort of a mantra for that family, and it's one I've tried to adopt, is that we choose joy every day. We choose joy every day, and that's just so powerful and something that I remind myself of every day. But they've touched my life in a profound way, and I'm so blessed to have met them and so happy that God put that family in my life.
We're talking to Chris Lowe here, the ESPN.com senior writer, college football writer here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. And obviously, as journalists, we can talk about other people's stories for days, and that's what we do is we write stories, we cover stories, we tell stories. But let's learn about your story, Chris, and you talk about your journey growing up. I know you grew up in South Carolina, faith, sports, school. What was life like for you as a kid growing up?
Well, I had a great place to grow up. I grew up in Rock Hill, South Carolina, which is just south of Charlotte, essentially a bedroom community of Charlotte now across the border, and was indoctrinated early in the ACC basketball, and grew up during the golden era of the ACC. Michael Jordan and North Carolina, David Thompson at NC State, just so many great names. And I can still remember going to the old Charlotte Coliseum and getting to see some of the NCAA regional tournaments. But I just, we don't get to pick our parents, Jason. God does that for us. And I guess we're all to some degree biased here, but I had 2 of the world-class best parents. My mom, Beulah, who passed away sadly about 3 years ago. My dad, Ted, is still living. Brother Patrick, sister Maria, and grew up in such a warm, loving home, and grew up in Woodland United Methodist Church there from the time I can remember. We were going to that church. There were so many people around us in that church. My dad's still there. Same Sunday school class he's been in there for, 50 years.
Hmm.
And when I go back to visit him, I still go back there, and just so many rich memories. And I'm like a lot of people. I grew up in church, was around it, and I kid people. At my house, it was a totalitarian government. There was no choice whether or not you went to church or not. When the doors were open on Sunday morning or in the evening on Sunday when we had our youth group, you went. I don't care if Dallas and the Cowboys and the Redskins were playing. It was tied up in the third quarter. You went to youth group.
That's right.
And at the time when you're 15 and 16 years old, you're like, oh, I'd rather watch this football game. But I think back to those times now, and God bless my mom and dad for planting that seed in me. Because I was like a lot of kids. You'd sit there and you're around it. You're introduced to Jesus Christ and his love, him drawing you nearer to God. But it was one of those things for much of my adulthood after that, God has always been a part of my life, but it was not a center of my life. It was not necessarily the center of my life. And as I grew older and I lost my mom several years ago, that's when you sort of go back, to those roots and to that seed that was planted. And boy, it's been something that's it's been life changing for me. But I'm just so blessed to have had parents like them that at a young age, I mean, every night, before we went to bed, we said our prayers, and to have that seed planted and be around such a loving and nurturing church, and just be somebody that was, again, introduced to Jesus Christ at a young age. And it's now something that I look back and think, boy, had I not been raised, in that family, in that church, where would I be now? So just so blessed and thankful.
When you, as you grew older, and I always tell people, and we talk about this a lot on the podcast, about the faith of your parents, the faith that you grew up in, and then the faith of your own. Tell me about that, navigating through that as you started getting into your career, into your 20s and your 30s, and even starting your own family, and realizing that the faith that you had to have at some point in your life became your own faith versus the faith of your parents.
Exactly. And that's a great way of putting it. And I think early on, Jason, I was working so hard to try to climb the ladder in a career that I lost sight. I mean, regretfully, or regrettably, when my kids were really young, I'm working so hard and traveling, working so many hours, that you lose sight sometimes of what's important.
Hmm.
And I did that. I did sort of stray and wander, but as your kids grow and as you get older and you start, and again, it's God chasing me, pulling me back in. You start to go back to your roots, and I think that's what happened for me. Is what, my mom and dad were such a great example for me. It wasn't that they, and I go back to what our good friend Inky Johnson always says.
Yeah.
It wasn't that they preached a sermon or were preachy, but you know what? They lived a sermon every single day. And I said, you know what? I need to do that same thing for my kids and for everybody. It's my example that counts. And that's what shows people, not telling them or shoving, our faith down people's throats, but showing them what God's love and what Jesus' love can do for all of us. And I think was when it sort of just, when I understood just how important and how powerful that was as I got older, that I wanted to be that example for my kids and everybody around them. And certainly when I lost my mom, it hit home even more, that I needed to be that example, and certainly need to do a better job of living a sermon and not so much preaching one.
What was that like as you walked through and navigated through the passing of your mom? And I don't know, you just, in terms of a lot of people, when, death and tragedy happens, they run away from God and some run towards God. And it sounds like you ran towards God and were encouraged more than you were angry, I guess, in her passing.
You know what? Initially, though, Jason, I didn't run toward God. I did sort of, not so much angry, but I strayed and was not as faithful and did things and was a part of things that I was not proud of, and certainly God would not be proud of. I just felt like, um, it was one of those things, one of those times, I guess, in a lot of our lives that we just sort of were stuck. And I think that's where I was. Again, not so much angry, again, you start to realize that, you know what, we don't have to understand everything.
Right.
We don't have to see, where everything leads to, or where every path goes, or the direction or the course. That's why they call it faith. And again, I know Jesus was chasing me, and that's what sort of pulled me back in. That, you know what, I need to be here for my kids, for my family, and I think that's what happened. And it wasn't immediate, but as I started to get away from her death, and as I don't know if it was a year or months or what it was, that's when I could feel it. And it's been it's every day I think about her, every single day, and again, that seed she helped plant in me, and it's been a blessing. And I've met so many people. That's the thing, the people that God has put in my life, the doors that He's opened for me, and it's amazing who they are sometimes, and just how subtle it can be. And you start thinking back through your life of all the different people and other different experiences, not all of them good, some of them bad. As I said, we were talking earlier, it's amazing. It's amazing where you can find Jesus Christ sometimes. And I did that. Some of the things, as I was talking earlier about straying and wondering, that's what I did. And it was a blessing in a lot of ways. And it's also a reminder, I tell myself this all the time, God does not punish His people. He prepares them. And boy, He's prepared me.
He obviously was preparing you to be a sports writer as well, Chris Lowe, and that's something that you do, and you do very well with ESPN.com. So when did that start to take shape? Because for me, that was a high school dream, college. Coming out of college, I wanted to be in sports, and I wanted to do broadcasting and journalism. I wonder, was that similar for you? Is that something you always wanted to do as you started to figure out what you wanted to be for the rest of your life, if you will?
It sure was almost a mirror image of you. I mean, I played basketball in high school. Was your average spot up shooter. Couldn't play a lick of defense. But enjoyed playing and played high school ball. But I definitely wanted to be into some type of sports broadcasting, sports media. That was a dream of mine. I love listening. See, back then, the games weren't on television. You tell people that now, my kids, that are 17, 19, you say, well, very few games were on TV, and we didn't have cable TV. So you listen to games on radio. And I grew up listening to Larry Munson do Georgia games, and John Ward do Tennessee games, and Kaywood Ledford do Kentucky games, because you could get these games at night. Marty Brenneman doing the Reds at night, because a lot of these Clear Channel radio stations, even in the Charlotte area, you could get them.
Oh, yeah.
And those people were my inspiration, and I wanted to do that. And so at a young age, that was a goal of mine. And it's amazing, again, how it all played out for me, because I thought I was probably going to go to South Carolina. South Carolina had a great journalism school. But at the very end, I said, you know what? I think I'm going to give Tennessee a shot. My dad had gone to Tennessee. I thought it'd be sort of cool to get away. And Jason, the people I met at Tennessee and the experiences, again, this is not by coincidence. The doors that it opened for me, I met and worked with several people there on student publications that ended up working at ESPN, and got my foot in the door. Guys like Joe Wojciechowski, whose brother Gene Wojciechowski, both those guys went to Tennessee. Dave Albright, who worked at ESPN, he was at Tennessee. We actually lived in the same dorm my freshman year, and Dave came down from Arlington Heights, Illinois. Well, later on, those guys were instrumental in getting my foot in the door. Jimmy Sexton went to school at Tennessee. Jimmy's one of the most prominent sports agents in all of the country. I got to know Jimmy. But the people, again, that God put in front of me, the opportunities, unbelievable. And it was a blessing that it worked out for me the way it did.
Can you share a story? This podcast is sports and faith. Right? It's the intersection of sports and faith. And I wonder if there's a story you can share or stories that you can share. And I know the Austin Peay story with the Ergel family was probably one of those, and even the Tyler Trent story. But can you share a story of where your job as a sports writer intersected with your faith in Christ, and how those two kind of came together?
Well, There are a couple. When I worked for 10 years in Nashville, the Nashville, Tennessee newspaper, covering Tennessee and the SEC.
Yep.
And I always kid Philip Fulmer because my first year was '97, and Tennessee won an SEC championship in '97, and then they won the national championship in '98. And I always tell him that I was his good luck charm. I don't know that he really believes that or not. And of course, I was his biggest pain in the rear too, because all the midnight calls you would get when I was trying to track down a story. But that was a great time in Tennessee's history. Pat Summitt was winning national championships. The football team was nationally relevant and certainly an elite program at that point. But there were a couple of stories then during that time that I did that I'll never forget, and stories that touched me in such a way that it's just hard to explain. But Nick Trail, who was a student manager on that Tennessee football team, Nick had a debilitating disease. He actually, he had a stutter. It was hard for him to walk and get around. He had to take the bus. He was the manager on that team and got to run through the T for the first time. Of course, the team runs through the band forms the T, and the team runs through. It had always been a dream of Nick's to do that. He did that. His dad wrote a poem about it. Everybody on that sideline, that game, was nearly in tears. And after the game, Philip Fulmer brought him to the front of the room and gave him the game ball. Nick's somebody that I still keep in touch with. He's a dear friend, and just an inspiration, and one of those guys that you look at and say, here's a guy, somebody else that God has put in your life to show you what being part of his kingdom is all about. That's one. There was another story. Eric Haig, who now works at UT, was also a manager. Sadly, he lost his dad and one of his brothers in a terrible car crash when he was younger. They were on their way to church. And another brother in the crash suffered a serious injury and was paralyzed. Philip Fulmer and the Tennessee program took him in, heard about it on the night of the wreck. He was in high school, I think, at the time, and called him. Peyton Manning actually called him. They brought him into Tennessee. Fulmer was like a surrogate father to him. Now, he's still at Tennessee. Eric is working. But I wrote a story about that, just that how even in the darkest of times, there's hope. And Eric is a great example of that. He's another guy that I still keep in touch with as a friend. So all those Pat's championships, the national championship that Philip Fulmer won with football in '98, those are the stories that I remember the most.
I also wonder, because as journalists, we're called to be objective. And I know that you take that seriously, as do I. But certainly as Christian men, I know when I see stories of athletes who are open about their faith and share it on the biggest stage, I quietly smile, maybe whisper an amen, or kind of shake my head and nod a little bit that, that's good. Use your platform to point people back to Christ. That's what it's all about. So how do you stay objective? And maybe it's easy to do this. So how do you stay objective but still live out your faith in your job?
Because we're all God's children, and he doesn't say that, you lift up or you build up or you do things because your neighbor agrees with everything you say or doesn't agree with everything you say. And I think you treat everybody the same. I was so blessed, Jason. I grew up during a very turbulent time in the South when all the busing was going on. Schools were just in the process of being integrated.
Yeah.
But God bless my mom and dad. I grew up in a home where we were taught to treat everybody with dignity and respect and kindness, regardless of race or religion or background or where you were from. And I think it's the same way as a journalist, that you look at every situation, from 1,000 feet away, and you treat everybody the way you'd want to be treated. And you're fair and you're honest and you're informed and you're candid with the people you're talking to. And that's always sort of been my mantra, is that you treat everybody the same way. It doesn't matter what story or what kind of story you're working on. And that's what I've always tried to do. That doesn't mean I've broken every story, because I certainly haven't. And I haven't gotten every story 100% right. But I've certainly tried my best, and I've certainly tried to treat everybody, no matter who they were or what their job was or what I was looking into or investigating, the same way.
Chris, this has been really great talking to you. Chris Lowe, ESPN.com, senior writer. Let's close with this. If you've heard our podcast, you know where I'm going here. What are you learning from God right now? This is a question we ask all of our guests at the end of each podcast, and I always am curious on what the Lord is teaching the different people that we have on the show. So what is he teaching you right now in this season of life?
That I'm not anywhere close to where I'm going to be. But I thank him every day, Jason, that I'm not where I once was. And that I'm getting there day by day. And I trust in his mercy. I trust in his grace. I trust in his wisdom. And I trust in his plan for me. And I thank him every day for helping me find opportunities to spread his love. That's what I've learned, I think, the most over the last several years, is that paying it forward and making an impact, positive impact on people's lives, what it's all about. And that's sort of what I've learned more than anything else, is that you go forward. And as my minister, Charles Maynard, always says, it's like a car ride. You get in that car and you ride and you live and you learn and you look and you listen. And I'm trying my best to do that every day.
Chris Lowe, ESPN.com senior writer. Really appreciate you sharing your story a little bit here on the podcast. Hopefully we'll get you back on and talk about a few other things, and just appreciate you. Thanks for joining us here on the show.
It was great to do it. I had a great time.
And many thanks to Chris Lowe, ESPN.com senior writer, for joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. I like talking to him about his journey, and certainly about the vulnerability that he had, and knowing that, his faith walk wasn't always the perfect one. And in many ways, that's an encouragement for you and I as we go about our daily lives, that our faith walks aren't going to be perfect. They aren't. But God, I don't think, is looking for perfection. I think he's looking for progress. I think he's looking for us to point towards him, to walk towards him, to pursue him on a daily basis. So thanks to Chris for joining us here on the podcast. You can check him out on Twitter at CLow ESPN, the letter C, then Low, L-O-W, ESPN on Twitter. You can check him out there. A father, a husband, a Christ follower. And he actually has the scripture verse, Titus 2:11, in his Twitter bio, which I forgot to ask him about, but I'm going to read it anyways as we close here. Titus 2:11 says, "For the grace of God has been revealed, bringing salvation to all people." It's a good reminder that God's grace is available to everyone, and that it helps bring salvation to all people that welcome in that grace and ask Christ into their hearts. Again, thanks to Chris Lowe for being here on the podcast. We also want to thank Compassion International. For joining us here as a sponsor on the Sports Spectrum podcast. $38 a month. Food, education, medical care, vocational training, all done in Jesus' name. That's what Compassion International is about. And we're thankful that they've been sponsoring this podcast for almost a year now. And they help release children from poverty. What a great thing to think about when we're looking to help others, when we're looking to figure out where can we put our hard-earned money that's truly going to make a difference. $38 a month, the best $38 you'll spend every month. Do it through Compassion International. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum, compassion.com/sportspectrum, and sponsor a child today. Thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. Reach us on social media at Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, sports_spectrum. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, and also check out sportspectrum.com. That's where all of our content is found. Daily articles, devotionals every morning at 6 a.m., and an opportunity for you to subscribe to our quarterly magazine. $18 for an entire year. Get you 4 issues, a brand new issue every 3 months of the Sports Spectrum magazine, the cornerstone of this ministry, founded over 30 years ago, started with the magazine, and it's still going strong today. Go to sportspectrum.com and subscribe today. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sports Spectrum podcast. Email me, jason@sportspectrum.com, if you'd like to reach us directly here at the podcast. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time right here on Sports Spectrum.